Akşit, Sayın İbrahim Cerrah, Sayın Mathieu Deflem, Sayın Emil Gomidov.
So that's good. So we have something to say that you haven't heard before. What I'm going to talk about is I talk about international policing in particular. I'm originally a student of sociology of law and social control and policing, and I was not specifically a specialist on terrorism. However, I published a book called Policing World Society, which was finished in manuscript form in August 2001, 2 weeks before the events of 9/11. And obviously, by the time the book was published, the entire dimension in which international police issues are understood these days is very different than before 9/11, particularly in the United States, but also, I think, in Europe. That's not to say, of course, that international policing doesn't have a long history, because it has a very long history, dating at least back to the middle of the 19th century. But 9/11 has clearly reshaped the dimensions of what the relevance is of international policing. Now, what I'm going to talk about today, and particularly in front of a largely Turkish audience, is I wanted to focus on the international police cooperation initiatives that have already been taken by international police organizations, specifically by Interpol and also by Europol, which I think is obviously also very relevant for Turkey and for the new European condition. Now, very briefly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a theoretical background of my study, but I'm going to keep that very short, and I want to give you a lot more practical information. But theoretically, I defend three positions, two of which are actually relying on the sociology of bureaucracy and bureaucratization process, which was originally developed by the sociologist Max Weber. There's two important points that I make. First of all, which seems to contradict somewhat what Sarah said, but I think that if I understand them well, it actually harmonizes with some of the points that he makes. First of all, I argued that police organizations, in order for them to collaborate internationally on a fairly broad multilateral scale, they have to have a position of relative independence from the government of their national states. Now, with that, I do not mean that they are completely divorced from the political process, but I do mean, and I do argue with Weber, that because the police, as a bureaucracy, has been given the right to enforce laws, to maintain order, and has even been given, let's say, the legitimate right, so the authority to enforce laws, if necessary, with the means of violence, that once this right has been given, that the police will build up a sense of expertise. It will build up thereby also a sense of professionalism. And it is on the conditions of this increasing expertise that police of various nations, irrespective of the many differences between those nations, legally, politically, culturally, and so on, will recognize one another as fellow experts in crime fighting. And that is one important condition. The next one is that in order for these police institutions to actually operationalize and to enact in cooperation, they have to have some common goal. They have to have a common interest. And I argue that this common interest is indeed provided by a sense that there is an internationalization of crime. Internationalization of crime comes in at least two forms. The first, the maybe less common the less commonly thought of as being an international crime is the following, is that certain local crime problems will take place under very similar circumstances across nations. Like a very good example of that actually is the increasing crime problems that have taken place in the former communist, Eastern European communist countries due to their transition to capitalism. You have certain, capitalism-related crimes, and indeed that is a process that has long taken shape in Europe and in the United States. I also call that an internationalization of crime, and that indeed accounts for some of the collaboration. Obviously, the other example is that crimes itself know no boundaries and go across national boundaries, and that is obviously very important in the case of terrorism, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. The third thesis that I defend is that despite this sense of collaboration, this kind of sense of brotherhood and sisterhood among police experts, that the various participants of international policing are still police of various nations, and they will still define these international problems more specifically in terms of the national relevance that they have. So the obvious example would be, let's suppose, for instance, that the Turkish and the United States police agencies collaborate in their common fight against terrorism, which indeed they can see, you know, we have a certain common problem, namely we have, you know, groups and individuals that use violence against civilians in order to obtain certain political, ideological goals. We both have this problem. We can both share a certain expertise, and indeed then on the ground, on a national level, the United States will fill it in maybe differently than the Turkish police will. See? So it is this is actually an important point that I will make, because there was a lot to do about, you know, how do you define terrorism and so on. Police have no problems with this, because they collaborate. You know, so, and actually we have no problem with this too, I would argue, because after all, when we were all invited to this meeting, we knew kind of what we were going to talk about, but we don't specifically share the same definition of terrorism. Nonetheless, as soon as you were invited, you knew that there were certain issues that you could discuss and certain other issues that you could not discuss. So on a more general level, there is a consensus, and that is indeed what drives this cooperation, at least to the extent that it exists. Now let me give you more a factual presentation about the two organizations that I will talk about. First of all, we have Interpol, the International Criminal Police Organization, which was originally founded in Vienna in 1923, so it's a very old organization. What is important about it is that, first of all, what is the status of the organization, and second, how does it work? The status of the organization, Interpol is not an intergovernmental organization. It is, in actuality, it is more like a private network through which the police of various nations can collaborate with one another. Now, Interpol also, in terms of the nature of its work, it focuses primarily on the swift exchange of information among its countries. So there is no such thing as, let's say, an Interpol police officer. There is no uniform which says, you know, I'm from Interpol, and although I'm Turkish, I'm going to arrest this guy from France in the United States. No, that's not the way it works. On the contrary, it is the various nations, national police, that participate and that can send information through its central headquarters, which is presently located in Lyon. So the swift exchange of information is already, I think, an expression of what is typical for a bureaucratized institution, namely that there's an emphasis on efficiency.